The Western was at one point in time Hollywood's most prevalent film genre. At their peak, you could compare the popularity to the current obsession with superhero films. However, the 80s hit the genre hard after stagnation in the 70s. From 1975 all the way through to the end of the century, only 2 Westerns finished in the box office top 10 for their year. Genre films are rife with influences from one another, paying respects to older films. The Western is no different, with their prevalence leading to a melting pot of shared aspects, including cinematography. There is a common use of visual language juxtaposing civilized life and the wilderness of the Wild West through cinematography within the context of some of the most iconic Westerns. The Western genre has been around long before cinema, but it wasn't until the likes of John Ford that the genre would find its first truly iconic director. His 1939 film, Stagecoach, became his first major Western that cemented him as a master. The film follows an unlikely group of strangers travelling across Apache territory in the titular stagecoach. The scene which portrays the travellers voting to travel on without the cavalry escort shows how Ford's cinematographer Burt Glennon draws a stark comparison between the setting of the characters discussing their situation to them disembarking Dry Fork alone and vulnerable. Glennon uses unconventional framing for interior shots, whereas a traditional wide would be used to show the characters and traditionally fill the frame. Glennon instead shoots the ceiling, leaving unnecessary empty space above the characters. He explained his process, saying, "It is a decided break from the conventional method of lighting sets and people. The ceilings were necessary because the sets were low, and it's a certain reality of perspective is obtained by the use of the 25mm lens. This creates an oppressive atmosphere, since the rooms are perceived as smaller, which in turn creates a sense of confinement, since the characters have visible limitations. The restrictions of the frame reflect the restriction of society that led the characters to their departure. The mise-en-scène strengthens this cramped atmosphere as well. The room is cluttered and the shadows are visible on the walls, which highlights the lack of empty space around them." Ford fades from this interior to an exterior as the stagecoach is separated from the cavalry. Written in the grammar of the shot, this description of the wide shot. Wide, encompassing shot that shows a large area of the film space. The environment or location is the star, and any persons or objects appear smaller within it. Glennon uses this shot to emphasise the breadth of Monument Valley, putting the camera above eye level so the viewer looks down upon the two parties split. Edward Buscombe explains the BFI film classic's book on Stagecoach. The vast panoramas across which Ford pans his camera, the tiny arc of the stagecoach appears pitifully frail. The people are minuscule and vulnerable, and the human drama of the stagecoach going along on their own seems small and minimal to the threat of Apaches looming over them through the majesty of Monument Valley, exposing the untamed land they are traversing. The next film that displays the Western's tendency to juxtapose interior and exterior shots is Sergio Leone's 1968 film Once Upon a Time in the West. The film follows a mysterious harmonica player and a moral outlaw who join forces to defend a newly widowed woman from a cold-blooded assassin working for the approaching railroad. According to Robert C. Cumbo, at the time Leone made the film, it was to be his last Western, and therefore it is legitimate to read the film as Leone's farewell to the genre and its conventions. After his incredibly successful Dollars trilogy starring Clint Eastwood, he sought to create an epic operatic film that would be worthy to allow him to move to his next planned project, which eventually became Once Upon a Time in America. Christopher Frayling cites Bernardo Bertolucci in Sergio Leone's Something to Do with Death. We place the characters in epic context, that of the first economic boom which was about to make the great epoch of the West disappear. Having been given a much larger Hollywood budget for Once Upon a Time in the West, Leone was able to actually film in America, as well as Italy and Spain, where he'd filmed the Dollars films. As West was to be his last Western, he wanted to fill it with as many celebrations of the genre as he could. One of these was filming in the iconic Monument Valley, made famous by John Ford in many of his films. With Leone's use of Monument Valley comes a similar juxtaposition between landscape and civilization. The chosen clip demonstrates a character going from outdoors to indoors. It could be considered that this itself embodies the film's themes of finality, which was portraying the encroaching end to the Wild West, a metaphor for the end of Leone's Western career. The clip begins with Claudia Cardinale's character Jill travelling to her homestead, stopping on the way at a tavern. We see the freedom and beauty of Monument Valley's landscape to the dingy, rough bar which encompasses the limitations that come with civilization. Leone cinematographer Tonino Delicoli shoots Monument Valley much as Ford does in Stagecoach. He follows Jill's wagon, but stays distant, which results in the valley's unique geography, towering over the small wagon, which alludes back to how Glennon shot the Stagecoach, using high angles and putting emphasis on the landscape. In the scene, he centres the shot around the tavern. It seems small and unimpressive in comparison to the environment. Whereas the exterior shots were shot in location in America, Delicoli recalls the interiors were shot in the studio in Cincinnati, Spain, allowing for greater control over set design and lighting. Leone transitions to a dark, dank-looking interior, which, after the majestic panoramas of Monument Valley, creates a sense of unease. The composition is cluttered and full of information as opposed to the wide open plains seen previously. There's little empty space, similar to Glennon shooting interiors in Stagecoach. The lighting is minimal as to recreate light seeping in through the tavern's shoddily crafted wooden beams, resulting in an unsettling feeling for the viewer due to the low-key lighting. Leone frames shots of areas of civilization as having restrictive atmospheres, as the railroad moving towards Sweetwater, and in turn close to the Pacific Ocean, symbolises the taming of the West. The final chosen film that uses this kind of contrasting cinematography is Clint Eastwood's 1992 film Unforgiven. William Money, a former outlaw gunslinger, has given up his life of crime and become a pig farmer. He reluctantly returns for one more job, which ends with the character taking brutal revenge. Unforgiven is considered a revisionist western due to its darker themes and the more realistic depictions of violence and morality. The film was Eastwood's farewell to the western genre, similar to Leone's Once Upon a Time, who this film is partly dedicated to. This is one of the last major modern westerns that was shot on analog film. Unforgiven's graininess worked perfectly as a tribute to the classic western films. It is therefore one of the last returns to a classic era of western genre film. The selected clip occurs relatively early on, similarly to the other two. The scene starts with Money talking to his daughter. They are framed in the doorway using a technique called interior framing, the effects of which are described in the book Grammar of the Shot. The effect isolates the characters even further within the frame and makes the scene stand out. The darkness in the foreground of the homestead is in direct contrast with the flat, open expanse seen behind the two characters. Eastwood's cinematographer Jack Green used low-key lighting, in part from Eastwood's thriftiness, but as economical as Eastwood was trying to be, Unforgiven's use of shadows and overwhelming darkness also added on to the realism that a director strived to achieve. The bounty job brings Money to reflect on his violent past. He refers to his past self as wild, and that his wife and children, as well as becoming sober, has changed him. As the scene transitions to Money attempting to mount his horse, the vast expanse of what is meant to be Wyoming, the film was actually filmed in Alberta, Canada, giving it a more barren, wintry look as opposed to the deserts and the rocky areas that became expected of westerns, partly due to Ford's influence. Here, Money is shot using a wide shot, whereas traditionally, the protagonist mounting his horse would be closer to glorify the character. The scene is not heroic, as he is desperate, and we are witnessing him journeying out into the wild from desperation. David Sterrett sums up the character's journey. Ultimately, he regresses to the savagery that he's laboured for years to expunge from his formerly violent life, and he got more racked than ever by futility and hopelessness. The film uses a comparison between interior and exterior, but in a darker representation, which drives the revisionist aspect of Eastwood's transformation back to vengeful veteran, murdering the townspeople and executing Jane Hackman's sheriff. The Western, like any film genre, has unique procedure in the concept and technique for how to create the film. A vital part of this is the visual aspect of the film, so having been the first major Hollywood genre, approaches taken in creating the look for films have been inspired by a litany of inspirational filmmakers. One of these aspects being the use of contrasting cinematographic techniques to reflect the contrast in the film's themes.